Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the Dialogues podcast series of the Global History Lab based at the University of Cambridge. My name is Elvira Tamus. I'm the course coordinator of the Global History Lab, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Richard Lechowick, our postdoctoral research associate at GHL, with whom I'm going to talk about memory today. Rick, I know this is a big part of your research. So, what can you tell us about the importance of individual and collective memory, especially for students and teachers of global history?
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Welcome, everyone. Obviously, I'm a little bit more informal, so get ready for an exciting live podcast that then we put up. But in terms of your question, basically the answer in long form is what I prepared to talk about for 10 minutes. But in short form, collective memory, building to collective identity, you can look at the world and argue that every major interaction that a state has is due in some part to memory. So it really can be, and it's not really randomized. It's foreseeable in some ways. If you understand the memory, how they're utilizing it, their actions will be chosen in accordance with that memory. I'll be a little bit more specific with some examples when I talk. But so to me, that kind of looking at memory in that way, it connects to absolutely everything in life, both for states and non-state actors, and to some degree, the individual as well.
Thank you so much. I hope this was an interesting hook for everyone for this talk. I just want to emphasize something that I didn't mention at the beginning. I would like you to know that this event is recorded, and we're going to share it on our platforms. Please be aware of that, and only ask a question or use your camera if you're happy to appear in this recording. So I'm going to ask Rick to give his longer talk, and then we have a bit of a conversation, and then the floor will be open to all questions and comments from our audience members. So please feel free to use the chat box to write any questions or comments you may have. So Rick, I'm wondering if you have a talk about the relationship between global history, which is our main topic in the lab, and our main approach, as well as international relations and power. This is something that we keep talking a lot about with our students in our meetings, and this is something that many students address in their own oral history projects. So if you could talk about that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, some of you, if you've heard me speak before, whether at Cambridge or on the radio or what, have heard me talk about memory and memory as power. And what I've done today is prepare the next 10 minutes to basically lead everyone through the 5 steps that I talk about with a global history focus on it. Um, so, should I start now?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you. Just to be clear, it's a short talk. There's 5 sections. The what I've titled it is When Memories Collide, Global History, International Relations, and Power. The first part is memory builds identity. The second part is identity drives action. So you can see they build on each other. The third part is controlling memory, controlling power. The fourth is memory as resistance, or memory as counter-hegemonic resistance. And the fifth is memory in the digital age. So that is what I will be speaking about. I see people here in the room from my QRM class, from the new narrative observatories, which is very exciting, from other classes. So you might have heard me talk a little bit about this, but I've never really gone into depth the way I'm about to do. So, welcome everyone. I'm excited. And thank you, Elvira, a lot. So, we often think of history as a background, so the stage on which current events unfold. But today I will explain or argue that memory, and more specifically collective memory, is a political actor in its own right. It doesn't just linger in the past. It shapes identity, justifies policy, and configures power. I said this once in the past, but my belief is that if you control the memory, you control the narrative. And if you control the narrative, you control the power. In the spirit of global history, it also cuts across borders and scales. It's not just about one nation. It's not just about how what one nation remembers. It's about how memory travels, how it transforms, how it collides across time and place. So over the next few minutes, I will walk you through those 5 steps that I mentioned, interconnected mechanisms, you could call them, uh, through which memory shapes international politics, history, other things. Um, and I mean that in the way is not stagnant history, evolving history. I'm going to use concrete examples throughout this, drawing on both state and non-state actors, digital and analog platforms, and a fair bit of war, colonialism, and forgetting. So, exciting times. Um, Part one, memory builds identity. So, if we start with the basics, collective memory forms the backbone of collective identity. I think most people would accept this as a starting premise. Collective memory generates collective identity, and identity subsequently drives behavior, geopolitical behavior in this case. But it isn't theoretical speculation. It's observable, it's measurable, and it follows patterns that you can predict. Um, Using a foundational idea in global history, which treats memory not as national property, but as a mobile, contested resource that is shaped by encounters, empire, migration, diaspora, conflict. Let me give you some examples. If you think about World War II, it's the same global event, but the collective memories that emerge from it are diverse. So those memories anchor national identities in profoundly different ways. Look at it as a global historian. A single interconnected global event produces divergent national memories that shape contemporary politics. In the UK, the dominant narrative is one of brave defiance, standing alone against fascism. And it's not just nostalgia, it lives now. It fosters an exceptionalist identity that underpins contemporary domestic and foreign policy, from Brexit to a performative global Britain role that insists on punching above its weight. In Germany, the memory is entirely different. This example is probably the most obvious using World War II, but rooted in culpability and trauma, especially the Holocaust, that memory gave rise to a pacifist, multilateralist identity. Germany's post-war reluctance to engage in military intervention isn't just a strategic choice, it's an identity encoded in memory. And you can see that manifested in German hesitancy around military intervention, including in Ukraine, and the consistent emphasis on diplomatic solutions, in the instinctive preference for international institutions. And this next example, which will come up, which the opposite sides will come up later in the talk, look at the United States. World War II is remembered as a moment of national moral clarity, the good war in which the US saved the world. And that collective memory fuels an enduring hegemonic identity, one that justifies military intervention and democracy promotion under a redemptive historical arc. The US was the good guys then, they're the good guys now. So I'm not claiming these identities emerged from nowhere. Some elements certainly predated the war, but these new memories became tools to reinforce, to solidify, to elevate existing tendencies into an almost unquestioned national myth. So same war, different memories, different identities, different behaviors. Also, it's important to note that memory doesn't simply reflect identity after the fact. It actively supports existing identities and it continually restructures and reinforces them. Um, yeah. As a global historian might think, they're not just isolated national narratives, they're part of a larger process of memory production that involves international institutions, commemorative diplomacy, even tourism. And memory travels, it crosses borders, and sometimes it collides. to part two, identity drives actions. In this section, think of the state as the main actor, the culmination of the collective memory into the collective identity bound into one gigantic, well, actor. um, but at each center, once memory has formed the identity, that identity goes on to shape how states perceive threats, how they choose allies, how they craft policy. And like I said before, it's not random, it actually follows patterns. And once you start seeing it, you see it everywhere. Like all the 80s movie references in Stranger Things seasons 5, if you haven't seen it yet. um, Let me demonstrate how pervasive and consistent this pattern actually is across different regions and time periods. When I was preparing this speech, Stranger Things was my reward afterwards. Okay, so Iran is a good example. In the 1953 coup, which was backed by the US's CIA and the UK's MI6, Prime Minister Mossadegh was overthrown, and it left a permanent mark. It gave rise to an anti-imperialist identity, as a lot of coups in that era would do. That even though a whole revolution later, even another whole revolution later in 1979, it helped explain everything from the nuclear program now to proxy alignments in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon. So it explains not just rhetorical um, positions, but concrete policies, being against Western hegemony, the 1979 coup itself, which was supported not just by Islamist clerics, but by feminists, Marxists, and secularists. So it explains something concrete, the behavior. Now look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Memory of Belgian colonial brutality fuels suspicion towards Europe and the West, and a modern pivot toward Chinese investment because of the memory and the identity. That's not just economics in a vacuum, it's history turned policy. And global history approaches can help us understand how colonial memory continues to structure contemporary economic relations across the global South. On a side note, Belgium has only recently begun to reckon with that colonial past. So it's a very different experience with the memories there, the identity. Some King Leopold II statues were removed during the 2020 protests, but many still stand. There's still a lot of statues of him there in Brussels and elsewhere. Whereas the Congolese memory of forced rubber extraction, systemic mutilation, mass death remains central to political identity and shapes possibly every interaction with former colonial powers. Maybe I'll take off possibly. Yes, it shapes every interaction with former colonial powers. So now think of Chile in South America. Chile's collective memory of the Pinochet dictatorship, alongside widely acknowledged U.S. complicity in the 1973 coup, helped shape a democratic identity now grounded in human rights and constitutionalism. That memory has made Chile especially sensitive to signs of authoritarian drift, both at home and abroad. It also underpins a longstanding skepticism toward the U.S. security cooperation, you might say, obviously, particularly in the realm of intelligence and military collaboration, where memories of Cold War interference remain politically salient. In fact, the American collective memory I mentioned earlier, the saving of the world, not just in World War II, but throughout the Cold War, is frequently contested by other national collective memories. And as such, their behavior also is different. They're competing narratives of the same transnational historical processes. We think of these as master narratives and counter narratives, depending at which level. It might be a master narrative in that country, but if you compare it across the globe, it might not be the master narrative shared at the UN, those kind of things. And of course, as a quick plug to those of you who are current or graduated GHL students, I officially invite you all to be research associates with me in our newly created research arm. The Narrative Observatory is looking at exactly this. So, had to drop the plug. In Afghanistan, memories of successive foreign invasions, British, Soviet, NATO, US led, has cemented a resistance identity, one that informs the Taliban's rejection of international presence and also makes sense of public support for sovereignty even under repression. Um, yeah, let's look at one or two more examples of how memories of imperial encounters shape post-colonial politics today. The ruling Chinese Communist Party has cultivated memory of the so-called century of humiliation, the Opium Wars, unequal treaties, colonial occupation, to craft a rejuvenation identity. And this underwrites territorial assertiveness, global infrastructure campaigns like the Belt and Road, and rejection of Western criticism on human rights as hypocrisy. And for the last one, in Turkey, Ottoman nostalgia has re-entered mainstream politics under Erdogan, shifting the nation from a republican identity to a neo-imperial one. And that memory pivots explains Turkish military involvement in Syria, Libya, and tensions with former Ottoman territories. All of those examples reflect the same pattern. Identity is memory, and identity shapes action. Or to go in the order of this talk, memory is identity, and identity shapes action in a very basic way. The patterns are almost predictable, where collective memory directly shapes threat perception, alliance preferences, concrete policy choices. Um, and both the last two, the Chinese and Turkish examples, demonstrate how memory and narratives can be cultivated by a party in China and almost by a single person in Turkey. Individual leaders can indeed transform collective memory. It's not immutable. With these official narrative cultivations in mind, I now turn to the next section, controlling memory, controlling power. In the approach I take, memory is not just personal or communal, it's institutional. And institutions, especially the state, have extraordinary power to shape what is remembered and what is forgotten. States actively shape collective memory through education systems, through commemoration practices, through the construction and maintenance of national narratives. And it's not accidental, it's strategic, it's deliberate, and just as importantly, it's continuous. Through schools, public holidays, museums, monuments, media, states construct what we might call official memory. Rather than think of these things like museums as places of passive record keeping, as someone would like you to think of them as they are, as institutional instruments of power. When states successfully control the master narrative about the past, they simultaneously control how citizens understand the present and imagine the future. That control grants them domestic legitimacy for certain policies while rendering other policies politically impossible or unthinkable. Consider my earlier example, how profoundly different countries remember colonialism or various wars or economic crises or even the pandemic. Consider anything, actually. The official memory, the version taught in schools, commemorated in monuments, celebrated through national holidays, fundamentally shapes which policies are perceived as patriotic versus which are condemned as treasonous. Look at Rwanda. Post-genocide, the government institutionalized a specific narrative focused on unity and reconciliation. And there were some great successes with that. Alternative memory, especially those that critique the RPF and highlight Tutsi atrocities, are actively suppressed. The official memory is both trauma narrative and legitimating device. And that's a good thing to call much of this official history is legitimating device. Russia is perhaps the clearest one at the moment. The Kremlin has elevated Soviet history in World War II. Soviet victory in World War II, the Great Patriotic War, into a quasi-sacred national myth. That memory is used to justify expansionism, suppress dissent, present Russia as both a savior and a victim on the world stage. And Russia weaponizes Soviet victory memory and imperial knowledge to legitimize territorial expansion in Ukraine and elsewhere. To be clear, this is not about what happened. It's about who gets to say what happened. The question of what really happened is never just about the past. It's a fight over the present and the future. The power to define what really happened is fundamentally the power to define what should happen next. Control over the past translates directly into control over present policy options and future trajectories. So while memory creates identity, controlling memory isn't simply about that identity. It's about what that identity can do and what it can be used for. And it can be agenda setting on a global scale. Whose past gets honored? Whose trauma gets international recognition? Whose historical frame becomes the default? This is power in narrative form. Um, but as I'll discuss in the next section, section 4, not everyone has a state. So, second to last part, memory is resistance, or the extra words in my mind are memory is counter-hegemonic resistance. So let's complicate the picture. Um, Memory politics work somewhat differently for non-state actors than they do for states. Non-state actors, communities, resistance movements, diasporas, don't control the curricula or national monuments. Non-state actors typically cannot exercise the same control over collective memory that states can through educational systems and official commemoration. States have institutional apparati for memory creation and maintenance. Non-state actors might, but they might not. That said, it doesn't mean they're powerless to affect memory. Their counter-narratives will exist and circulate, but they operate from a position of structural disadvantage. Yet, this lack of institutional control generates different dynamics that can turn out to be quite powerful. For stateless actors, memory can become the primary form of soft power. I don't mean stateless people, I mean for actors who are non-states. Memory can become the primary form of soft power. The Kurdish memory of Halabja or the Anfal campaign is kept alive through songs, commemorations, and oral history, often in defiance of the official state versions. The Palestinian memory of the Nakba operates as a counter-narrative to Israeli state history. It fuels some international solidarity, defines diaspora activism, and grounds claims to land and return. Tibetan memories of cultural suppression or Uyghur memory of disappeared mosques and family members are acts of resistance, refusing the erasure built into authoritarian memory regimes. And they don't have to be authoritarian, just memory regimes, refusing the erasure built into memory regimes. Memory regimes. I haven't used that term before, and I like that I came up with it. These communities preserve memories that directly challenge and undermine state narratives. So memory itself becomes a form of resistance when you lack military or institutional power. Even the Islamic State, ISIL, weaponized memory, and I'm including it here as a non-state, though proto-state might be a better term for it. But it used the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, a century-old colonial treaty, as propaganda. Why? Because the memory of arbitrary imperial borders still holds emotional and thus political power in the region. They weaponized collective memory of French and British colonial intervention and the arbitrary borders that were imposed to challenge the legitimacy of the entire contemporary state system in Syria and Iraq. The historical memory became a tool for delegitimizing present arrangements. And diasporas play a crucial role here. The Armenian diaspora may remember the genocide differently or even more intensely than the Armenian state, than from how the Armenian state does. And it uses that memory to lobby, educate, influence globally. They can also do things that the state cannot. Diasporic communities often preserve and intensify collective memories more strongly than people still living in the homeland, and they exert influence on homeland politics from abroad. Irish Americans promoted and preserved memories of the famine and British occupation that shaped wider American views on the Troubles. So that memory influenced US policy and public sentiment. A good example that even memories abroad can shape politics at home. Migration creates transnational memory communities that shape politics across borders. That's a very global history sentence. Memory preservation by a non-state actor shapes international political dynamics. In the same vein, global history can remind us that memory doesn't just live where events happen. It travels with people. And sometimes it becomes stronger in exile than it was at home. For stateless peoples, especially, and this time I do mean stateless, collective memory becomes their primary form of soft power. It's how they maintain political claims across generations without controlling territory or possessing military force. For the community I worked extensively with, the Yazidis in Iraq, memory is perhaps the most important political resource available. Now, to the future. My last section, memory in the digital age. Modes of memory are changing. And I want to use this final section to address what I believe what fundamentally changes the future trajectory of collective memory studies, global history, international relations, conflict studies, and pretty much most or all of the social sciences, and that is technology. Many modern generations go through a radical transformation. Electricity, the combustion engine, penicillin. I would suggest that our generation's radical transformation is digital. Digital platforms are revolutionary. Sorry. Digital platforms are revolutionizing how collective memory forms, spreads, and how it competes. Social media platforms have broken the monopoly of official memory makers. Anyone with a phone can now document, narrate, and distribute memory in real time. Social media enables the creation of new collective memories in real time, often completely bypassing both state control and traditional societal gatekeeping mechanisms. We saw this in the Arab Spring with Black Lives Matter, with Gaza. We're seeing younger generations develop entirely different memory frameworks, and they respond to international conflicts in ways that are fundamentally different from how their parents' generation responded. The traditional gatekeepers of memory, schools, monuments, museums, official state commemoration, are rapidly losing their monopoly over memory creation and transmission. This is good and bad, in my opinion. It democratizes memory. It allows marginal voices to be heard. Digital technology enables previously silenced voices to construct and disseminate counter-narratives that challenge official state narratives. But it also fragments the collective. Competing echo chambers generate parallel histories. A single nation can house 20 different pasts. There are more and more competing collective memories and thus identities within the same societies, shaped by entirely different digital echo chambers that reinforce particular versions of events. There's a joke we used to argue about what happened, but we argue about whether it happened. That was a poorly said joke. So there's the joke is, we used to argue about what happened, but now we're arguing about whether it happened. And you see that a lot with the expansion of conspiracy theories everywhere. And also the data workers, the groups all around the world that put out false information. Now, as global history increasingly engages with digital archives, memory activism, platform politics, we need new tools to understand not just what is remembered, but how it circulates and mutates. And in the end, whether the digital transformation is ultimately beneficial or harmful in this regard, I am unsure. It's a bit of both. To wrap up, memory is not background noise. It's a structural force in society and global politics. It creates identity, it drives preferences and action, it legitimates power, it empowers resistance, and it is being radically reshaped in real time. We've spoken about how memory creates identity, that identity drives action, how control over memory enables political power, how memory operates differently across state and non-state actors, and how memory politics is currently being revolutionized in digital space. It's the long version of that. Global history gives us the framework to see these patterns, not as isolated anecdotes, but as global processes, connected, comparative, political, and personal. We live in an interconnected world where the same historical events are remembered differently across and within borders. And those different memories shape how nations, communities, and people interact today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. This was fascinating. You touched upon several questions, topics, issues I wanted to raise. So thank you for that. I just want to reflect briefly on a couple of things you mentioned. When you talked about the Second World War and the narratives that the Second World War created in different countries, it's so interesting for me because I'm Hungarian, and obviously Hungary was allied with the Axis powers. So it's a defeat narrative that we had, growing up. Obviously, it's not a question how. Um, in my opinion, that society have not really managed to come to terms with their contribution to Second World War and Holocaust, for example. So that's this narrative that the Germans invaded us. It wasn't really an invasion, to be honest, in March 1944. But obviously, it's a bit more convenient to say that we were also victims of Germany who did all these terrible things, and we just happened to be there. There were active, proactive perpetrators within the society, and that's how so many Jewish and Roma people, etc., were murdered. And now I live in the UK, where obviously, November is the month of remembrance, but it's a victory narrative. We lost people, but even losses, in my opinion, intertwined with a sort of glory of we were victors in the Second World War, and like there was a price we paid, but we defeated the bad guys, and they were the poppy in November. So it's really interesting for me to think of the Second World War, reflecting on where I grew up and where I live now. So that was one thing I wanted to mention.
Could I, while you get
Yeah,
to that
yeah.
second thing, could I respond to something you had? I think that's very interesting how Hungary deals with it. And I think that's something you see in a few states around Europe, particularly, but also the other interesting narrative I think that comes out is the countries that claim to be neutral. So Switzerland, Sweden, I think are still dealing with whether they were really neutral or not, but they pushed that narrative for so long. It's only more recently that it's becoming more widely acknowledged that maybe that neutrality was actually not always there. And the other thing is in terms of in the UK, that feeling that even the deaths were for a grand idea, a grand end. I think that is part of actually utilizing memory and narrative. It's sacrificing. If you can convince people that sacrificing yourself for an idea is a great thing, then it changes the identity, it changes the memory, it does everything. So that's actually very much in play in the UK, like you say. Sorry, please.
That's super interesting to hear, and very important, yes, to talk about neutrality as well. There's a related narrative that I'm very interested in, which is the narrative of the witness, right? A lot of people just reflect on, yes, the society where I'm from. A lot of Hungarians would say that, I mean, we didn't intervene or we didn't help because we would have been murdered as well, right? So there's this idea that what could we have done at that point? And there's a lot of guilt, I think, throughout generations, whether we could have done more or not. So the witness narrative is also really interesting in these affected countries. You mentioned Russia. I know that for a lot of Russians, the Second World War is basically their war and their victory. And a lot of them think that we won the war for the Allies. So yes, there was Britain and the US and France, but we won it. We paid a price. Our blood was the price of this victory because we lost so many people. So even among those who won the war, there's this kind of competition sometimes, like who actually sacrificed more, whose victory is it? Especially because that victory, that joint victory, was followed by the Cold War. So that was obviously a competition between two superpowers. And the last thing I wanted to mention, and then I would be very happy to open the floor for questions and comments. But you talked about colonialism, which is another story that we talk a lot about in GHL, and a lot of our students can relate to it. And again, I just want to mention rather, I think, particular East Central European idea of colonialism. Because I think for a lot of European countries, European identity is sometimes intertwined with the fact that we were people who conquered territories, who colonized territories. And there's this idea, which is obviously the core of a lot of debates around today's society, but what do we do with this memory? Do we need to, for example, what we need to do with migrants, refugees who come from territories that we ruled before? So there's this debate there. And I know that in several Eastern European countries, there's this idea that, oh, we're not going to take refugees or migrants because we were not colonizers. So our European identity is very different from the Western European identity. We were actually colonized by the Soviet Union, or you can go back actually, Ottoman Empire, in Southeastern Europe, and then the Habsburgs, and then the Nazi Germany and the Soviets. So there's this rejection of this, let's say European Union joint responsibility, saying that we were not colonizers. We didn't have colonies. We didn't have diamonds. We didn't have slaves. And I find it really interesting how people relate to these ideas. I don't know if you have anything to add to this point.
Well, I just think those are all completely perfect examples. On the thing you said right before this on the competing narratives in World War II, I talked about, a victor's narrative, a loser's narrative, but it might be more interesting what you said is if you were actually going to compare is the contesting narratives of who won. Like, oh no, I'm the one, the US, the UK, Russia. That's very interesting because those narratives don't fit together. Whereas a winning and a losing narrative may fit together. The winning and winning narratives won't. Um, but also, you can see how that kind of identity you're talking about fits into everyday politics. Look, we didn't colonialize. Why do we have to help people? This is your fault. You deal with it, and it's very much memory, identity, behavior, like that. So yeah, everything. I agree with everything you said, and I find it super interesting. So I could talk about
Yeah.
it forever.
Yeah, very interesting things. Thank you so much. I think we have talked enough by now, and I would like to ask our audience members if they have any questions or comments to add to these points to Rick's fascinating presentation, or if they have any questions, if they want to mention any examples from their own education, maybe, or how, as students of global history, they reflect on memory. How do this global historical perspective shape the way you think of memory, individual or collective memory? You can use the chat box or raise your hand and ask your question.
We have a small group this time, so I
It's a
understand.
small group, but
Yeah. Thank you.
yes, it was. I agree with it was a thrilling and exciting presentation. Okay, while people are thinking, I think I have a rather challenging question to you, Rick. Is there a historical narrative, a collective memory narrative that you would change if you could? Or how you is there, and let's put it this way, is there a narrative, collective memory narrative that you think we could change, or we should change, or people in that country could change, and why? How a narrative could be made more healthy, if this question makes sense?
Yeah, well, yes, totally. It makes sense. I think a lot of the say 2017 to now, transnational things we've seen, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, movements like that are basically a narrative, a counter narrative to a master narrative that has defended the perpetrators. So if the master narrative has always said, no, things are okay as they are, but it doesn't acknowledge the unfairness, the structural pain, everything that is caused, what I would do is, if I could, blend the narratives, but really make it so that those master narratives do acknowledge the reality. Because what master narratives do over a long period of time, especially if controlled consistently by a power, is, for lack of a better term, whitewash the history. Just make it so that as many people as possible are content with their position. And I think uh, some of those narratives have done that. The other one is colonialism. It's changing the views on colonialism, but there's still a lot of people who hold the belief that, you know, it was the white man's burden. Um, and they always focus on what they perceive to be the positive aspects of colonialism, uh, while keeping very strong blinders on against every negative thing that it caused. So it's kind of, if I could change anything, it would be to incorporate the counter narratives, the global transnational counter
Mhm.
narratives into those regional master narratives.
Mm. Thank you so much. We have a comment from one of our attendees. She mentioned the mental health aftermath of the Beirut explosion. I'm not sure if this is a question or just a comment to our discussion. I don't know if that's something you want to say anything about, Rick,
Well,
or
I will say I just happened to be lucky enough to have taught QRM for GHL in Beirut. Not, I was
wow.
based here. Sorry, in Lebanon. And a lot of students did projects about that topic. Um, and from what I'm aware, and I'm not an expert, so please correct me, is after the Beirut explosion, there was so much trauma, and there's a recent history of Lebanon that has a lot of trauma, that so much of it needed to be acknowledged finally. So mental health became something that people were a little bit more open about. I don't know if open enough about, but people getting help, doing things like that. Now, as I said, I'm not an expert, but that is what I got through my students' projects.
Thank you. Thank you. And then we have a comment from another audience member, a question for Rick. We've mostly been talking about memory in relation to history, but what are your thoughts on how memory is represented in literature?
Sure. Interesting question. I don't know if I'll have a perfect answer. I assume by literature you mean fiction, because nonfiction, I guess we could consider history, and that's a different discussion. If how memory is represented in literature, I think that specifically with fiction, people like to at a surface level say this is fiction. It's not, don't take it as the truth. This is whatever. And say, you know what? I'll take Game of Thrones. I'll take Game of Thrones for this. Even though everything in there is fake and there are no dragons, it is very reflective of history and memory. So much of Game of Thrones is just taken from English and British medieval history, and you can see it mapped on there. So it's taking this history, and that history is determined by whoever's in charge in the U.S., the U.K., the U.S. and the U.K. because he's American. But so the U.K. national narrative, the memory of the Middle Ages, is expressed. The U.S. generally agrees with that expression, and it influences the writer in the literature to write something while it's completely fictional, it's very reflective of the official memory of those two countries, which also means that it can be reflective of a counter narrative, or other ideas. Literature doesn't have to do that, but literature can very, very easily. And I don't know if I could even say that it's not possible to do this. I think it has to be reflective of the cultural memory and history of the author, the identity of the author. So it's still all tied with memory, identity, and history. And I think it's actually still reflective in literature. And sometimes it's more obvious and sometimes it's less obvious, but I think it has to be there.
Thank you, Rick, and I hope that answers the question. I do have a question which is slightly related to literature. I'm very into arts, all forms of arts, especially fine arts. And in my free time, I usually go to museums, exhibitions. It's one of my hobbies. And I was just interested in your experience, Rick. Can you recall an exhibition? It could be a permanent exhibition, a recommendation that we can visit that you find good enough, an exhibition dealing with memory. Or you can mention a temporary exhibition you saw once that really made an impact on you and how you think of memory. Any kind of exhibition anywhere in the world that has to do anything with collective memory that really kind of stuck in your memory, in your own
Yes,
words.
I have an answer to the second part. I do not frequent as many art museums as you might. I do go to some history museums, but I remember being very affected, and this is a historical museum, by the Pergamon Museum in Germany, which is an amazing museum. I was, however, studying abroad in Turkey. So I was a student in Turkey, took a holiday and went to Berlin, and I went to this museum. And it is amazing because they rebuilt parts of the city and temple in the museum. So they just lifted something out of where it was from, which is Turkey, and then put it down there. And I remember it's so impressive and awe-inspiring, the same way when you see any megalithic ancient ruins. Um, and then for some reason this is why it stuck with me. They chose to interview me afterwards to say, what were your feelings about this? And because I was a snide 19-year-old, 20-year-old, not that all 19, 20-year-olds are snide, but because they asked me what I thought about it, and I just said, I think you should return it to Turkey. And that was before I was kind of aware of the Elgin marbles and all that. But I get torn in things like that in the British Museum, in that there is the possibility that some of those things might have been destroyed if they stayed. Like if you see Nineveh in Iraq, Nineveh's been destroyed, and it's so sad, and it can't be. Or the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. However, who says that another country can come in and just take them? I don't think anyone could say that. So in that way, I think, especially because I like history museums, historical museums, statues and stuff, I get affected by a lot of history. There's a museum in Italy, well, the Uffizi, which is pretty well known. They have a room where every single bust of every single Roman emperor is lined up around the room. And to me, that's just amazing. You can see, and because the
Um,
Romans at that era really liked to be realistic, you could see exactly what everyone from Augustus to whoever the last one was before the Vandals or Goths came in. I should know that. Um, but so in that way, I do feel that way a lot. History, I think the narratives and I think there's changing though. And oh yeah, that was your other question. And like, are there any recommendations? I did actually go to the British Museum recently, and they had a huge um, discussion of the history of the museum and kind of maybe the entanglement with colonialism that it had, and that there's certain things that should be fixed. And then it focused a lot on actually Native American and New World indigenous people. And in the same way, the History of Natural Museum in New York, when I went there, they kept up, and this is the debate that people have now, they kept up this very colonialist, racist looking mural of, say, white Americans meeting Native Americans for the first time. But what they did, they kept it up and then had a huge plaque about what aspects were wrong. And that's the debate people have. I don't have an answer to that one. But that's what I see in yeah, history and natural history and ancient history museums.
wow, really interesting. I actually Googled some things you mentioned, and I'll make sure to visit these places. I think we're coming to the kind of last part of our discussion today, the last part of this podcast. If anyone has any questions or comments, please put them in the chat box or raise your hand. If not, I would like to finish with one question that I'm very interested in, and I'm intrigued by your thoughts on this. So in the Global History Lab, we talk a lot about the histories and collective memories of places we've probably never visited or we don't have much connection with. And what I see in the last part of GHL, which is students completing their own oral history projects and writing an essay, which is published on our website, it's really interesting because there are some students who deal with, specifically with stories of their own communities. And there are students who reach out and who work on countries and societies and cultures that they don't necessarily belong to, right? They don't have no roots there. And yeah, I just wanted to ask you about this, like this phenomenon, like why do you think some students choose either this option or the other option? But more importantly, how do you think, I mean, maybe if you could just say a few things about both, like the advantages and disadvantages of doing so, because sometimes students ask me what to choose, a topic that's related to me, that's close to me, or something that I can be more objective about. But then what if it's a topic that I don't know much about, I don't speak the language. So mainly what I'm interested in is the benefits and maybe the pitfalls of these two approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I've talked to some students about this, but I don't think one way is better than the other. I think there are benefits and pitfalls to both. I think coming in as an outsider into a situation or group, you have different ideas that can both be new and interesting and helpful in terms of analysis, but also you have to be aware of them to make sure you're not letting some kind of ethnocentrism cloud your view. It also, the other pitfall is that you have to work a little bit harder with a group that you are not a part of. And so the opposite of everything I said is true for the other side, is if you're working with a group, you probably you don't really need to work too hard to find informers. You don't need to do too much, but sometimes it's hard to think outside of your societal box, and that's where having an outside point of view might help. But you also, the other positive being within the in group is that you will understand certain things that may not be explained verbally or physically, is that you just know certain aspects about the culture. So it really is, I'm torn between the two. I think there's pros and cons to both. It's just whichever one, I always say, whichever one someone picks to do research with, focus on the negatives and positives. So be aware of what exciting stuff you're bringing to it, but also be aware of the pitfalls. And do that right at the start. Be as aware of the negatives as the positives. But they're both, maybe go back and forth throughout your whole life, going back and forth. They're both really exciting.
I hope it's useful piece of advice for students who will watch this podcast and choose an oral history research topic later this academic year. Well, this was a brilliant discussion. I don't know if you have anything to add, Rick, any last thought that we haven't touched upon today?
I don't think so. Thank you for those of you who came. Hello to all the future listeners of this. But thank you, Elvira, as well.
Yes. So please join me in thanking Rick for this wonderful talk and brilliant answers to our questions and comments. Thank you very much to all our audience members for contributing to the discussion. And please watch this recording and then follow us, follow our website and our YouTube channel, and do join our future dialogues podcast conversations. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.